The basic phrase that I think we all know, that I'll talk a little bit about, is that nature abhors a vacuum. And it's true, and I agree with that myself personally. Selena and I quarrel about this frequently. But what's really behind this? What's behind this idea? There's a more holistic, albeit counterintuitive statement that I think underlines the principles at work behind this one, is that nature abhors you and me. Now, I know that you're all hippies, and it's kind of difficult and uncomfortable for you to admit that, to think that Mother Nature, she sustains us, she supports us, with all the animals and the trees and the whatnot. It's hype, okay? It's like if you believe that a McDonald's burger tastes better than a Wendy's burger, it's because you've been told by McDonald's that the McDonald's burger tastes better. And for this reason, we can believe that Mother Nature actually can't stand you having something that everybody else doesn't. And when we have conditioned spaces like indoors, like I mentioned before, heated, cooled, dehumidified, humidified, we have something that other people don't. And the underlying, the central issue here is that between the us and her debacle is that there's a very convenient and self-serving Marxist political agenda. There is a circulating manifesto here that discusses fairness this and equality that. And fairness is fine, but at whose expense? Mine. And yours. But nature doesn't care about you, your family, your comfort, or indeed your survival. And she's quite willing to take away the heat and humidity, the conditions that we need to survive and be healthy and happy and all the rest, and unceremoniously take it away from you. And what she'll do is she'll take it and distribute it wantonly with the have-nots of this planet, like these guys, this guy, and indeed the have-not planet Earth. So what we're talking about here is in the manifesto, I should say, there are very deliberate wording like equilibrium, drawing a line between areas of high concentration of something or other and low concentrations of something. This creates a differential, and first of all, start to look at thermal differentials. When we have absolute zero, for example, it's so cold that it couldn't be any colder. You've got all these particles, right? You've got this atoms and molecules that are just fixed in space, absolutely unmoving. Now you add a little bit of energy to it, and you start to vibrate. Now you add a lot of energy to it. For example, in the air here, there's a tremendous amount of energy that makes us all comfortable. And these things are smashing each other, not only at great force, but at frequencies that you can't believe. We're talking about 4 billion collisions per second. So there's an incredible exchange of kinetic energy, and it's sort of like chaos. It's like free-for-all. It's a big college frat party, and everybody's like just dancing and kicking and grooving, and there's a lot of energy, a lot of kinetic energy, and this will actually go on forever and ever and ever, except there are forces that work against us. If you go into the war room that Mother Nature has figured out, the first line of attack to rob us of the things that we require is Operation Steel Heat Thermal Conduction, right? So it's like, all right, man, first line of attack, there's a house up there on the hill operating at 20C. They got insulation in there that's going to inhibit our progress, but let's set up a perimeter, establish a thermal differential, get up there, men, I want that heat, right? So she into this party where everybody's like kicking and grooving, right? She sends in these cool daddies, like, what's up? Right? And everybody else is like, got a lot of energy and they're moving around. You see these folks here at our frat party just like, having a great time. And then she sent on these goons. And you know these people, they're takers, right? They're not givers. They're like, And so what happens is these guys were dancing, bounce into each other and bounce into the cool daddies, who then are like, okay, so they get some energy and they start saying, okay, well, this is fun, and then they bounce into the next guy, and on it goes, collision after collision, interaction after interaction, slowly, particle by particle, moving from the party zone to the outside. When that happens, what happens? Mother Nature takes this heat and distributes it to the meerkats. And that's ostensibly what's happening, right? Except it's not that simple. Well, after she sent those guys out, she's like, all right, air, this is the stuff we breathe. She goes, okay, remember when I taught you buoyancy? When you kind of rise, when you heat up? Remember how to do that? Excellent. What I want you to do is undermine those bourons that I just sent over there to rob the heat through conduction, and I want you to find any kind of discontinuity in the thermal envelope in the outside walls of the house. For example, here, here, and here. And just quietly, without anybody noticing, just take it out of the house. Through buoyancy, by establishing a pressure differential between the inside and the outside. Because you're rising up, and these discontinuities won't be able to stop you. So it's kind of like this party that was happening, that was just, everybody's having a great time, isn't actually a party in a house. It's a party on a train, and they're off to Siberia, and nobody even knows it. So that's the kind of situation we're looking at. So what's ostensibly happening is you have a mass of air with a whole bunch of, air molecules in there, air particles. You add a little bit of heat, and that same amount of mass starts to get bigger. And because it gets bigger, it gets lighter because there's fewer particles in there. And its slack-jawed cousin over there, that dense, cold stuff, just sinks to the bottom, whereas the warm air goes to the top. Pretty simple, but very effective if you want to remove heat from a house. So conduction is extremely inefficient. There's a lot of things that need to happen. It's like a bureaucracy, right? Whereas convection, buoyancy, is pretty effective. So that's the kind of insidious tricks that Mother Nature is willing to do at the expense of the conduction people and everybody else. So those are the two mechanisms of heat transfer that we're looking at first. But do you remember now, grade 8, and the dancing you would do would be like, it's not like you're having a bad time, but there's not a lot of energy. And it's actually pretty, you can conserve a lot of energy that way. But there's not a lot of flying sweat everywhere. There's not a lot of pheromones, you know what I'm saying? It's just pretty contained. Whereas on the other hand, we go back to our college party, there's like sweat going out, there's pheromones, there's all kinds of things radiating out of these particles. And that's what we call radiation, electromagnetic radiation. And what's amazing about this is that we're exchanging this kind of radiation all the time. For example, we're exchanging with the ceiling and it with us and our friends and all the rest of it. The trouble is when you exchange with something that's a different temperature than you, it's an unequal relationship. So if we go by a window, for example, in the winter, let's assume it's not leaky. Hard to find, but let's just assume. And it feels cold, it's because I'm radiating outwards, and the stuff that's outside, minus 15, sky, cars, trees, whatever, are not giving back. They're takers. So this is all set up against us. And so those are the three mechanisms of heat transfer. Now, we were kind of duped as kids to believe in some of the stories that were told, and the three pigs and whatnot. They make things a whole lot more complicated. Ironically, there was a lot of huffing and puffing and blowing the house down, but the brick house, the ubiquitous brick house, is the leakiest of all the kinds of houses. There's hundreds of little cracks all over the place. So perhaps it shouldn't have been the one they sought refuge in. But these three guys are not ham, but rather heat, air, and moisture. And when they get together, they make building science, very interesting indeed. So we're not only talking about those three mechanisms of heat transfer anymore, but we're talking about how they interrelate with moisture, which we'll start to look at now. When we have areas of high concentration of moisture, vapor, for example, in the air, remember, this is a differential between low concentration, high concentration. There's always a movement towards equilibrium. Now, diffusion, a little bit like conduction, is very inefficient. It goes through the pores and the tiny little interactions that it needs to, to eventually lead into the areas of lower concentration. And you can imagine this situation here. This is a shriveled up balloon, not some sort of weird organ. But this used to be filled with helium. And helium will slowly diffuse through the latex. And that's the kind of situation we're faced with, something that's very slow, but very dependable. It's going to be happening, and it's happening all the time. In fact, it's happening in the walls right now, particularly in the winter time when there's a huge vapor pressure differential between really kind of warm, moisture-laden air. Like we cook pasta, we're taking showers, we live and breathe. There's a lot of moisture in the air, but there's very, very little moisture that can be contained in the air on the outside because it's cold. And it's, I guess the analogy that you can imagine is that, remember when we were looking at air and buoyancy, when it expands, there's a lot of room between the particles, and there's a lot of room for moisture to kind of sneak in there and be comfortable. There's not a problem. There's no problem until things start to cool down, and then that moisture gets squeezed right out of there. And it looks for the first solid surface it can find, and then just kind of sticks to it. And that's called condensation. You see it all the time. In fact, your beer cups, not glasses, but they may be wet on the outside if it's cold enough. So that's the kind of situation we need to be wary of in a diffusion situation with moisture diffusing towards the outside in the wintertime. Somewhere in here, if it gets cold enough, it might start to condense on a cold surface. And then you're into the world of mold, you're into the world of deterioration, and you don't even know it because it's inside your wall. So I'll talk a little bit about how to plan for that sort of thing. Well, that's diffusion. I'm going to get a sip of beer. So here is a wall assembly for the Mountain Equipment Co-op in Ottawa, which it's just one example, but it's kind of cool because it's got some fairly low embodied energy insulation in there. But it's just an illustration of what might happen. You can imagine from the cold winter side here, past the sheathing, in here it'll be colder on the outside than the inside, and it'll find some opportunity to condense in there. And if it happens at a rate that's quick enough, you could be accumulating a lot of trouble. Now, I said that heat, air, and moisture are tricky when they get together because not only do you have diffusion, which I said was that slow process working through the material at a pore level, but you also have that crazy convection thing, that buoyancy and that air pressure differential from the inside to the outside. So you have a lot of moisture going through your walls, and this is a brick house that they sought refuge in, but it could very well be on its way down because of the mold and deterioration. So that's that sort of situation. I think I'll just skip over this one. What we see here, I think I actually put it in the wrong place. I'll come back to this later. I just wanted to give a summary midway, not quite midway, towards the end, but not quite there. We've looked at equilibrium, and that drives all the changes that we have. Temperature, conduction, from warm to cold. We have diffusion from areas of high concentration, vapor pressure, to low areas of concentration. We also have air pressure and high and low. And they're distinct mechanisms of moisture and heat movement, but but they tend to influence one another, but they are also really quite different in certain situations. So we had the dancers who were doing the conduction thing. We had the air leakage, which was that train to Siberia. We got the radiation, which is the pheromones. We've got the condensation, the vapor pressure, and the air leakage and condensation, which work together. So moving on, what do you need to do to deal with this kind of situation? You have to select appropriate materials in your wall assembly, because we're talking about a sandwich situation. We have like 5 or 6 layers in there, and they all do different things for different reasons. So if you put, oftentimes, if people aren't really careful, you could put, what's called 2 vapor retarders, which is one layer which prevents diffusion towards the outside. And if you put another one on the outside of your wall, you trap it right in there, and that's going to be an issue for you. We want to reduce thermal bridges, which is one of the slides I skipped over. I'll go back to that in a minute. I just mentioned the only one vapor retarder. We have to make it airtight. That is so important. I said it twice. You see, that's not a typo.
First rule of fight club.
What's that?
First rule of fight club.
Exactly. And then, once you've got it all airtight, you want to have a little bit of mechanical ventilation to bring in fresh air. My house does not have that, so I have to be really careful about breathing. Yeah. So I'm going to go back to that thermal bridging one. Here. What do I mean by thermal bridging? When we have insulation, what does that really mean? Everything insulates and everything conducts. It's a relative statement. If I have insulation, it just means it conducts heat less efficiently than something that was not called an insulator. Metal is really good at conducting energy through conduction. Other things like wood, relative to insulation, is very good at it. It's 3 times the conduction. So in a case like this, what we're looking at is thermographic imagery. And what it's showing us is the temperature of things on the outside in a wintertime condition. Now there's something in here, I suspect it's a metal lintel that's carrying the load. So you can have your doors or whatever these are, windows. And you can see it's a lot warmer here. There's a lot more conduction happening here than elsewhere. And that's called a thermal bridge. And our houses, if we keep on doing the same old, are rife with these sorts of things. So that's just one of those problem areas that one needs to consider carefully. So where we're these are some pretty interesting things. Spray foams are kind of they're coming out, and they're not exactly new, but they tend to be an improvement. Over here is cellulose insulation, which is recycled newsprint, more or less, with some borax in there to prevent mold and critters. And that's just kind of blown in willy-nilly, and then you kind of cut it off later with a big knife. And that's a pretty effective way to insulate a building, and it has very little environmental impact in its production. High on the environmental impact, very high indeed, is spray foam insulation, which is arguably one of the best kinds of insulators, except what's the damage to the earth? If you're not mad at Mother Nature already. But if you weren't, I mean, how bad is that for the planet? And the answer is pretty bad. But on the other hand, over the lifetime of your building, you may save a lot of energy because you don't have any air leakage through there, and it has a very high thermal resistance. And you get to wear a funny suit when you do that too. This is Roxel, which is a Canadian product. This is made of rock, and they kind of melt it down and spin it, sort of like fiberglass. It's like a bat. Insulation kind of fits in between your studs. It's good, and it's particularly good for fire resistance and whatnot. And this is a really interesting marketing ploy that they have. It's a hydrophobic coating that they have on this material, which makes the water kind of rush off of it if you're to pour water on it. But that doesn't address the actual issue. The issue is less about rushing water than it is about diffusion. And what does it do when it gets soaked? It'll soak the wood that's next to it, and then the wood will rot. So this doesn't actually help anybody, but it looks really cool. Exterior insulation. We have this stuff. It's available in blue and pink. Typically, it's extruded polystyrene. That's usually used on the outside of buildings. It's a rigid board kind of thing, and it's particularly useful on the outsides of buildings because then you don't have crazy thermal bridging. For example, metal studs here, they're like a highway for heat. They just love it. So it's a three-dimensional heat loss, and if you put exterior insulation on the outside of it, you're golden. Lovely. And then you put brick on the outside. I will be talking a little bit about the functions of layers in a half a second, so I'll probably come back to this. One of the ways that you stop air movement in and out of the house is through this stuff, sort of a foggy picture here, but this is called house wrap, spun bonded polyolefin. It's basically Gore-Tex. And actually, I may have my facts just a little bit wrong, but they're mostly right. That the guy from DuPont who figured out Gore-Tex, his brother or cousin, something like that, took the same idea, tweaked it just a little bit, and made house wrap spun bonded polyolefin. It's this stuff that does not let water through, but it allows vapor diffusion through. Very important difference. So you can have driving rain all over this stuff, and it's just fine. But it allows diffusion to come through, so you don't have condensation. Very, very cool. So we wrap our houses with Gore-Tex now. But what they do is also it can help to stop air movement. So you consider it to be your air barrier, and you take this stuff judiciously everywhere you can. And there's a lot of places you need to tape up, but it's easier on the outside by a long shot than on the inside, where you have all kinds of extra bits. So, but it's very easy to forget stuff. Like here, they didn't tape this joint, and if you're not like really, really conscientious about how you're taping and how you're making sure that the air can't get through, you're gonna have air leakage, and then you're worried about some damage down the line. So this is a kind of a cool cross section of some of the barriers and some of the assemblies, the critical stuff. I'll go from the outside in and what these parts are called and what they do. So we have siding, and what that does obviously is it keeps the majority of environmental factors, hail, which we had the other day, crazy, rain and whatnot, that keeps it right off the building as much as possible. Behind that, you'll have a weather barrier. They're calling this house wrap, but it's better to call it a weather barrier because it's kind of, that's the majority of its role, is a weather barrier. Beyond that is sheathing, which is kind of a structural thing, so your walls don't rack side to side. Kind of cool if you want it to stay up. You have studs, obviously, which are your kind of structural members. You have bad insulation in between, if you choose. Then we have this polyethylene vapor barrier, vapor retarder, here that prevents the diffusion from the inside to the outside, like we talked about earlier. And then the drywall, which functions to be a substrate for your hanging pictures. So these are some of the things that we use. It's really, really important for the building science community and everybody to kind of start to understand some of the kind of confusing terminology. When we say weather barrier, we're talking about all the rain that kind of gets between the siding. It can also act as an air barrier. This polyethylene vapor barrier back here, it can also act as your air barrier. Your air barrier is an incredibly important thing, but you have to choose which one it is. It can be both, but you have to be really careful to make sure it's totally continuous. A vapor retarder, on the other hand, does not need to be continuous. Because you're not talking about an air pressure difference, which will find any kind of crack in any direction. You're talking about a vapor pressure difference, and it's only from high to low, and it'll go straight. And there's no turning around corners. So it doesn't have to be continuous, but it has to be there for most of it. Like 99% would be fine. So there's a lot of confusion there, and although I don't have a lot of time, I just want to stress that part. So we had a weather barrier, we had an air barrier, could be there or there, and then a vapor retarder. Retarder only because it resists moisture, it doesn't have to stop it. We just need to manage it, right? So, did I switch slides? So we haven't figured out, right? We know what the assembly is supposed to look like, what goes where, when, so on and so forth, right? No. The trouble is that we have a kind of an insult to injury situation that Mother Nature has thrown us. The trouble in a mixed climate like Toronto, we don't know where the cold side is. In wintertime conditions, that's obvious. The cold is on the outside, right? But in the summertime condition, it's the opposite. So we have blazing heat, high humidity, craziness all around, and we have air conditioned inside. What happens if you have a hydrophilic cladding like brick, which just soaks up this moisture, just like hungry for it, or a wood siding or anything like that, just kind of soaks it in. It's laden with moisture. Sun hits it from east, south, or west, whichever, and there's a tremendous vapor drive inward. And where does it go? We're talking about diffusion again, but it's going the other way, and it condenses on the polyethylene that we have to resist the moisture in wintertime conditions. But of course, it's flipped around, and now we don't have the vapor pressure gradient. When the sun goes away, we don't have the gradient to dry out again. There's a tremendous amount of failures in the East Coast with that, because they have regular east winds, and then they have the sun that comes up in the morning, just drives it in all summer long. You got mold, you got deterioration, you got a lot of problems. Houses are just ripped down, and each year, new houses are built with these moisture problems because people. There's just a lot of confusion, understandably, and builders are so busy building homes in a very tough business. To spend time learning about this stuff. I had the luxury of going to university and thinking about it a whole lot. So that's, unfortunately, I can't solve all the problems. I can't explain exactly what you need to do. I just kind of wanted to highlight some of the important areas to question if you're buying a new house or thinking about that sort of thing. So, the real Mother Nature, I hope you can see what she's really all about. It's all about taking what you have and not letting you keep it. Let's give it to the have-nots. And then, so we looked at the dancers. If you're likely, we also took a look at the likelihood of the space that you're dancing in actually being a train. If you are sprayed with somebody's head sweat, spray back. And the final comment, I suppose, is that 3 little pigs are complicated people. So thank you, everybody, and happy Nerd Night. There may be questions. If you have questions, please ask. Yeah.
Typical healthy. So a lot of us live in old. If we live in Toronto, we live in old houses. And if we had, if we wanted to address PFAS or let's say energy efficiency in our home, we talked a lot about the air pressure barrier, and having a good air envelope to make sure that as opposed to things today. Would you address which one do you do first? Like, do you try to make sure that the house is airtight before you address issues of humidity or heat loss, or do you try to make sure that it's airtight? How do you approach it if you have an old home?
Did everybody hear that? The question was, if you have an old home, which aspect do you address first? Air movement or vapor or insulation or whatnot? Each case is dependent on a lot of things.
Like those eco-energy audits, they come put a blower in the front
yeah.
door, right? And they try to find the leaks.
Yeah.
Is that, like, what comes first there? What's the best way for practical money saving?
Well, if you're extremely thorough with your air tightness, you'll save a lot of energy. But if you don't have a mechanical system bringing in fresh air,
right, which we wouldn't in an old house,
which you wouldn't in an old house, you could ostensibly run into problems. If you have crappy windows, and I'm happy that I do, because I tightened my place up quite a bit. And if I replace my windows now, which is the major source of air leakage, I would have to, bust everything open and put in an HVAC system, or at least a little bit to kind of bring some fresh air in. But most of the time, you're not going to be able to do that thorough job of getting your air leakage to be that much lower, because there's just so many cracks. There's cracks that you can't see. The majority of air leakage will happen in your headers, so basically on your floor. Underneath your floorboards, there are joists that are, the structure of your floor. That's where most of your air leakage is going to come out, because you don't have sheet goods, you don't have anything really preventing the air from coming in. So if you were to do one thing to stop most of that air coming in, from the basement, I would probably open up the drywall up there and either spray foam it or cut something and kind of foam around it or caulk around it, because that's where like 30% of your air leakage is going to come from.
Okay, so it's like a one big heavy area.
Yeah, big heavy area. Question.
How does an igloo work?
How does an igloo work? In terms of diffusion resistance?
In terms of keeping people warm inside.
I built an igloo when I was 15, and I'm still living in it. No, they're actually pretty interesting. If you put a candle in an igloo, you can get this thing, and just a candle, you can be relatively warm. The other thing is you have a chimney that lets it smoke, and you enjoy the electromagnetic radiation from a fire. So remember the partiers who were flinging their sweat and their pheromones? They are operating at a very high energy, and they're exuding a lot of radiation, like tons of it, and we can just bask in that warm glow and feel that heat, even though the temperature is still below zero. If that makes any sense. So it's still ice, and it's not melting, but it's still comfortable. So that's why I still have it.
Why is spray foam so evil?
Spray foam so evil? Well, there are carrier gases and things that like HCFCs and all the things in refrigerants that we're trying to remove. They have huge environmental sort of like ozone depleting properties, and for example, like in all commercial buildings, they have to have management procedures in order to manage these horrible liquids responsibly, and so on and so forth. Often these are used as carrier gases for the spray foam, so you're having a lot of environmental impact that way. There is eutrophication, which is like the destruction of water on a permanent basis in the production of some of these plastics. There's a lot to say about it. That's not really my area, but it depends. I mean, like, if you look at how long would it take in order to, if you look at things, spray foam in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and its production and how much it's going to save you over the life of your building, it's a very small amount. So embodied, impacts, in my research so far, indicates that it's not a huge amount over 50 years. But if you were to, say, do your cottage in spray foam, you may have to own it for 600 years before you ever got that back. So I'm not talking about money, I'm just talking about greenhouse gases, eutrophication, other things like that. So you have to be careful. If you can go without, go without. That's my view. But there's no perfect solution for installations. If you have low embodied energy and impact installations like cellulose, that recycled newspaper stuff, or even fiberglass or rock solar or any of these products, they have a lesser impact initially. But they allow air through. So if you have an air pressure differential, air will be moving. Bats don't stop movement; they kind of resist it. And if you have any kind of extraneous air leakage that you hadn't really planned on, it'll go right through. It's called wind washing. But if you have spray foam, it's locked in there, it's solid, and for that reason, it may in fact be better over the long run. But nobody owns a house for very long anymore. So you build a new house, and you have 14 years, knock it down, put up a new one. So it's hard. Nobody's